Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drug that made British people behave in ways they normally apologise for. And if you've ever been to Britain, you know people apologise for things that weren't their fault to begin with. This is the kind of drug that doesn't just lower inhibitions. It seems to remove the part of you that understands how to behave at all. People didn't just act differently, they acted wrong, running into traffic, climbing buildings, fighting things that weren't there, as if something inside them had been switched off and something much more unpredictable had taken its place. The drug is called monkey dust, which for once is exactly as serious as it sounds. Tonight we're tracing how the cheapest high in post-industrial England became the one nobody could manage, and how it didn't make people stronger. It just made them impossible to restrain. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're lying right now, perhaps tucked under a blanket halfway between curiosity and sleep. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Here's what nobody tells you about monkey dust. The first part feels like the best decision you've ever made. You feel it within minutes, maybe seconds, depending on how you took it. A warmth, but not the lazy warmth of an opioid. More like someone turned up a dial labelled confidence somewhere deep in your chest. Everything sharpens. Sounds become crisp. Your thoughts accelerate, and for a moment, just a moment, they form actual lines instead of their usual tangle. Your body feels like it works. Not like you've taken something, like you've corrected something. There's a distinction there, and it matters. Cocaine makes you feel like a better version of yourself. Monkey dust, at that first dose in those first minutes, makes you feel like you've finally become the version of yourself you were always supposed to be. Competent, alert, ready for whatever's next. That's the part the zombie drug headlines never mention. The reason people take it a second time is not because the first time was terrible. The first time was extraordinary. Then the first dose starts to drop off. It happens faster than you expected. 20 minutes in, maybe 30. The clarity begins to smear at the edges. That dial in your chest. Someone's reaching for it. You can feel them reaching. And something in your brain, something that is not exactly you but lives very close to you, says, one more, just to maintain, not to get higher, just to stay here. You redose. The second dose hits differently. Still good. Still that sharpening, that sense of rightness. But something small has shifted. The way a key sounds slightly different the second time you turn it. You notice it, and then you don't notice it because the drug is already working, and why would you stop? You redose again. By the fourth or fifth time, the intervals between doses have gotten shorter. The craving is no longer a question, it's a fact. Like hunger, except hunger doesn't make you afraid when you can't satisfy it immediately. This makes you afraid. Not of anything in particular, of everything simultaneously. A general fear that sits in your sternum and hums. The first hallucination is subtle enough that you almost convince yourself it isn't one. A shadow in your peripheral vision. You turn. Nothing. You turn back. The shadow turns with you. Your skin starts doing something. A crawling sensation. Not painful, just wrong. Like something is moving just underneath the surface. You scratch. The sensation moves. You scratch somewhere else. It moves again. This continues for longer than it should before you understand that scratching will not help, that the sensation is not coming from your skin but from somewhere further in, somewhere you can't reach. You're sweating. You became aware of this some time ago, but you can't remember when. Your heart is doing something interesting. Interesting is the word you use internally, because the alternative word is frightening, and you're trying very hard not to be frightened, because you have noticed that the fear and the heartbeat are feeding each other, and you would very much like to interrupt that loop. You cannot interrupt the loop. The thing about monkey dust, The thing that makes it different from most stimulants you might compare it to is that it doesn't just accelerate the brain, it removes a specific function. The function it removes is the one that says, enough, not stop exactly. More like the gentle internal signal that updates you on where you're relative to where you should be. The signal that says, this much caffeine and you'll be fine, this much more and you'll feel wrong. Every stimulant mutes this signal to some degree. Monkey dust doesn't mute it. It finds it, picks it up, and places it somewhere you cannot locate. You keep looking for it. You are aware, distantly, that you have now been in this state for longer than you intended. The original plan, whatever it was, is no longer visible. The plan belongs to a version of you that was formed before the first dose, and that version is now inaccessible, like a tab you closed by accident and can't find in the browser history. Your body hurts, you think, in some vague sense, or it should hurt. There's something happening with your knee. You may have hit it on something at some point in the last however many hours, but the information isn't arriving the way it usually does. Your brain is too full of other signals. Pain has been downgraded to a rumour. You've heard it's happening somewhere in the building, but you can't find the room. The pain receptors are still functioning. They are sending their messages perfectly correctly. The messages are simply not being prioritised. This is a crucial distinction that the word superhuman will completely obscure when it appears in a newspaper headline tomorrow. You're not stronger than a normal person. You're a normal person whose signal prioritization system has been temporarily, or not so temporarily, taken offline. The world has started doing things it shouldn't. Not dramatically. Not movie hallucinations where the walls melt and the sky turns green. Quieter than that. More convincing. A face outside the window that looks like it's watching you. A sound from the room next door that seems specifically designed to mean something, if you could just decode it. A feeling, very strong now, that the situation you're in is not safe. You don't know what the situation is. You're not entirely sure where you are. But the feeling of unsafety is absolute. It is the most certain thing in the room, and your body is responding to it the way bodies respond to certainty. Adrenaline, motion, the urgent sense that standing still is not an option. You are pacing. You have been pacing for some time. Someone says something to you. You understand the words individually. You cannot make them cohere into a sentence. The person seems to be moving toward you, and the part of you that used to evaluate threats has promoted everything to a threat. So the person moving toward you is a threat, and the appropriate response to a threat is something your body has already decided without asking you. This is where the story becomes hard to tell from the inside, because the inside has stopped being accessible. What's left is motion, sensation, the overwhelming imperative to get away from whatever is happening, or to stop whatever is happening, but either way to do something immediately, with the considerable amount of energy that is currently moving through your body, with nowhere specific to go. The needle, by this point, is buried so far past any normal line that the concept of too much has stopped functioning. You're not stronger than you were this morning. You're simply unable to receive the information that would make you stop. That's the whole story. Really, in miniature, a drug that doesn't add something, takes something away. The thing it takes away is the ability to stop. The story of MDPV starts, as many terrible ideas do, with something that was originally reasonable. In the early 1960s, chemists working in pharmaceutical research were exploring a class of compounds derived from cathinone, the active ingredient in khat. The plant East African and Middle Eastern communities had been chewing for centuries for its mild stimulant effects. The khat plant had a long, entirely undramatic history of use. Farmers chewed it. Markets ran on it. Moderate stimulation, moderate effects. Nobody particularly concerned. The researchers weren't interested in khat itself. They were interested in what happened if you modified the basic cathinone structure. Tweaked here, added there, filed the serial numbers off. The result was a family of compounds called pyrovalerones. Pyrovalerone itself, the parent compound, had modest commercial success. Briefly marketed in some European countries in the 1960s and 70s as an anti-fatigue agent, sold under names like Centraton and Timogix. Prescribed for depression and exhaustion, the kind of drug that sounds perfectly reasonable until you learn what class it belongs to, at which point it sounds considerably less reasonable. It worked, after a fashion. It also had the abuse potential of something that worked, which is to say, patients liked it somewhat more than doctors were comfortable with. Significantly more in some cases, the kind of significantly more that prompts quiet meetings, the kind that produces documents describing discontinuation of commercial availability in the careful language that pharmaceutical companies use when what they mean is, this one got away from us a little. It was discontinued. The word quietly carries more weight than usual here. The cat plant watched all of this from across the Mediterranean with its usual stoicism. It had been providing mild stimulation to people for several centuries without any of this drama. It found the drama unnecessary. It had no comment. The researchers kept tinkering. In 1969, chemists at Boehringer Ingelheim, a German pharmaceutical company respectable enough that its name appears on medications you might currently have in your bathroom cabinet, synthesized a new compound in the pyrovalerone family. They were looking for something with greater potency and therapeutic utility. They found the first part. The compound was methylene deoxypyrovalerone, MDPV. At the receptor level, it was roughly 10 times more potent than cocaine as a dopamine reuptake inhibitor. 10 times. The researchers looked at those numbers, looked at each other, presumably made a note in German about this being rather a lot, and quietly did not proceed to clinical trials. The compound was patented. That's standard procedure. You patent what you synthesize whether or not you intend to develop it, because the paperwork is easier than the alternative. And then they filed it. Not in a dramatic sense. Not with the awareness that they were preserving something for posterity. They filed it the way you file a receipt from a restaurant you'll never return to, mechanically, into a cabinet, in a drawer, among hundreds of other compounds that didn't make the cut for reasons of efficacy or toxicity, or the basic commercial calculation that the benefit-to-risk ratio was not going to clear regulatory review. The drawer closed. The year was 1969. Men had just walked on the moon. The world was busy. Nobody had time to worry about a compound that was too stimulating to be a medicine. They had other things going on. For 35 years, almost nothing happened. MDPV sat in that patent, technically accessible to anyone with the right databases and the patience to read mid-century pharmaceutical documents in German, but visible to virtually no one, because virtually no one was looking. The pharmaceutical industry moved on. New therapeutic targets, new compound classes, new regulatory priorities. The cathinone, derivatives were a chapter that had been read and set aside. The patent system in its wisdom had made the information public. That is the bargain. You file a patent, you get protection for a defined period, and then the knowledge belongs to everyone. The protection on MDPV's patent eventually expired. The knowledge belonged to everyone. Everyone, it turned out, included some quite particular people. The cat plant, meanwhile, kept growing, kept being chewed, didn't particularly care about any of this. In Yemen and Ethiopia and Somalia and Djibouti, the daily ritual of the cat session continued as it had for centuries. Social, mild, embedded in the fabric of ordinary afternoon life. The cat plant had never asked to be the ancestor of anything. It was simply doing what plants do. Then, sometime in the late 1990s and early 2000s, a different kind of chemist began paying attention to pharmaceutical patent literature. These were not researchers in labs, not pharmaceutical company employees. They were people who had developed a very particular skill, the ability to search databases of expired and dormant patents for compounds that had been synthesized but never brought to market. Compounds that were technically legal, because nobody had explicitly scheduled them as controlled substances, and that had in some cases quite interesting pharmacological properties. It was, if you squinted, a form of archaeology. A chemistry dig through the filing cabinets of mid-century pharmaceutical research, looking for the compounds that got away. There were more of them than you might expect. The 20th century had been extremely productive in the synthesis of novel psychoactive compounds, and the pharmaceutical industry had, for entirely commercial reasons, tested many more things than it had ever brought to market. The gap between synthesized and approved for medical use is where most compounds spend their entire existence. It is a large gap. It contains multitudes. The people searching it were patient and technically skilled and operating in a legal space so grey it was essentially the colour of a London morning in February. The community was small, online, self-consciously scientific in its language, in the way that communities are when they are doing something that benefits from scientific framing. The forums were full of careful language about dosing protocols and harm reduction, which sat somewhat awkwardly alongside the central project of identifying and synthesizing novel psychoactive compounds in home labs. But people have always been talented at holding adjacent contradictions without noticing the adjacency. The forums had their own culture, detailed reports, milligrams measured to the second decimal point, discussions of receptor binding affinities, a genuine curiosity about pharmacology that, in different circumstances, might have led to medical school, long threads on onset times, peak windows, duration of effects. These were not people who were cavalier about what they were doing. They were people who were precise about what they were doing, which is a different thing entirely, and not always safer. The term of art was research chemicals. If a compound was being studied in a laboratory context, it existed in a legal grey area. It wasn't a controlled substance because nobody had gotten around to making it one. It wasn't marketed for human consumption, technically. It was being researched by people in their kitchens. The scare quotes were doing considerable structural work in this arrangement. MDPV entered this world around 2004 to 2007, first in Germany, then Eastern Europe, then gradually spreading through the research chemical marketplace to wherever curious and chemically literate individuals were spending money online. The early reports were, by the standards of the scene, enthusiastic. Better than cocaine, multiple users noted. Cleaner, some said, meaning the stimulation was purer, less, cluttered with the peripheral effects that cocaine brought along. Longer-lasting euphoria on the initial dose. Nobody mentioned what came after the initial dose, or rather, some did. The warnings were there in the early forums, buried in threads that didn't have the traffic they deserved. Notes about compulsive redosing, notes about the difficulty of stopping, notes that the crash was severe and the craving for more was unlike anything the poster had previously encountered. These notes sat in the forums alongside the enthusiastic reports. The enthusiastic reports got shared. The other thing MDPV had going for it, beyond the initial effect, was legality. In the years before 2010, neither the United States nor the United Kingdom had specifically scheduled MDPV as a controlled substance. This meant that if you labelled it something other than a drug, bath salts, for instance, or plant food, or research chemical, and added the phrase "not for human consumption" to this packaging, you were operating in a space that existed between law enforcement and whatever it was you were actually selling. Head shops understood this space extremely well. So did the people who supplied head shops. The companies producing MDPV, mostly operating out of postal addresses in Eastern Europe, occasionally China, were synthesizing it in bulk and shipping it westward. It could be dosed in milligrams, which meant that a small packet contained many doses, which meant the economics were extremely favourable to everyone except the person eventually requiring emergency care. The not for human consumption label was, legally speaking, doing a job that it was not designed to do, and that it performed with considerable confidence given the circumstances. Nobody at any point in this supply chain believed that anyone was salting their bath. The fiction was understood by all parties. It was simply a necessary fiction, the kind that makes certain commercial activities possible, in the gap between what the law says and what people actually want to do. The law had not caught up. The products were already on the shelves. Both of these facts were true simultaneously, and they would both remain true for longer than they should have. By 2009, MDPV containing products had names like Ivory Wave, Vanilla Sky, Cloud 9, and Purple Wave. Bright, cheerful packaging, colours that belonged on a children's cereal box, fonts that suggested summer and energy, and something that was definitely, absolutely not a powerful stimulant that produced acute psychosis at higher doses. A price point low enough that the just try it once calculation was available to almost anyone who walked past a gas station counter in Louisiana on a Tuesday afternoon, which is an unusual amount of power for a compound that was sitting in a German pharmaceutical drawer in 1969. The patent Boehringer Ingelheim had filed in 1969 was now, 40 years later, generating revenue. Not for Boehringer, Ingelheim. For a gas station in Baton Rouge. The people buying it at this stage were not yet the people the story would eventually be about. They were curious. Young, mostly. Adventurous in the way that people are adventurous when the activity in question is currently legal and available at retail. Some were people who faced drug testing for work or probation and had learned that standard drug screens didn't detect MDPV. The compound was new enough that testing panels hadn't caught up, which was itself a selling point the more entrepreneurially minded vendors were not shy about mentioning. Some were people who had heard that this was better than cocaine and wanted to find out if that was true. Some of them found out. Some of them found out several more times than they had planned to on the same day, because the first dose was so short-lived and the craving for a second was so immediate that what had been planned as a single experimental evening became something that looked by morning considerably more like a 7-hour tunnel. The forum warnings existed. They had been there from the early threads, users describing the compulsive Ridos phenomenon with a specificity that should have given pause. One account that circulated widely. I had planned to try it once. 7 hours later, I'd redosed 11 times and didn't know where the time had gone. MDPV was drawing something out of people that they hadn't known was in there. The part that doesn't know when to stop. The warning sat in the forums alongside the enthusiastic reports. The enthusiastic reports travelled further. This is a pattern that predates the internet by a considerable margin and shows no sign of changing. MDPV didn't discriminate by income or background in those early gas station days. It was in the marketplace, it was legal, it was cheap, and it was potent. Those four qualities together make a combination that draws a wide net. Students, workers, people on parole, people. People who are curious in the academic sense, and people who are desperate in the immediate sense. People who had money for it, and people who spent money they didn't have for it. The demographics would shift. Within a few years, the population using MDPV in the UK would be almost entirely drawn from the most economically marginalised communities, because at £2 a hit it would be one of the few things still within reach. But that story was still ahead. In 2009 and 2010 the story was simpler. The drug was working its way through a market that didn't yet know it had limits. The poison control centres across the American South were beginning to notice something. The call volume was rising, and nobody on the other end of the line had a protocol for this yet because nobody had needed one before. Before monkey dust became a British problem, it became an American one, and what happened in America shaped everything that followed. The American Association of Poison Control Centers tracks calls by category. In 2010, they added a new one. The calls that were coming in didn't fit existing categories. The callers were describing patients who had taken something legal, something sold in a packet, something that might have been labelled bath salts or plant food or ivory wave, and who were now in states that the centres didn't have protocols for. Not opioid overdose, not cocaine psychosis exactly, something more extreme, something that didn't respond the way things were supposed to respond, something that, in several cases, required the caller to describe a situation that was still ongoing when they picked up the phone because the patient was still in the room, still in motion, and still appeared to have no intention of stopping. In 2010, they logged a few hundred calls in this new category. In 2011, they logged over 6,000 calls in 12 months about a drug that 12 months earlier had barely registered on the federal radar. The speed of that number matters. It is the speed of something that was already everywhere before anyone noticed. Drug epidemics that emerge that fast are not beginning. They have been developing quietly, in places where calls don't get made before they surface in the data. The government had not yet done anything. MDPV was still technically legal, and in the American South in particular, it was available on counters next to lottery tickets and energy drinks, which tells you something about the regulatory infrastructure that was supposed to be paying attention. The emergency rooms of Louisiana and Florida and Mississippi were seeing something they hadn't seen before. Patients arriving in full psychotic breaks. Not calm, confused patients who needed reassurance and monitoring. Patients who had been brought in by police or emergency services because they could not be managed in the field. Patients who were still fighting. Patients who were screaming in a way that communicated genuine terror rather than performance. Patients whose vital signs were doing things that vital signs are not supposed to do. Heart rates in ranges that suggested the cardiac system was under extraordinary load. Body temperatures elevated enough that the question wasn't just sedation, but cooling. Blood pressures that bounced between extremes in ways that made monitoring difficult. Not calm, confused patients who needed reassurance. Patients who believed, with complete conviction, that the situation they were in was a matter of life and death. Patients who were responding to threats that were not visible to anyone else in the room. Patients who could not be sedated at the doses of benzodiazepines that would normally bring a person to stillness. Because MDPV is not cocaine. It is not in the same bracket of potency. A cocaine psychosis patient gets 5 milligrams of a benzodiazepine and settles. An MDPV patient gets 5 milligrams and asks what that was supposed to do. The drug's binding affinity at the dopamine transporter is so high, and the resulting dopamine flood so extensive, that the sedative systems the drug should have to compete against are simply outmatched. The pharmacology makes the standard protocol insufficient, and the physician who has never seen this before has to improvise in real time. This is not an ideal situation for anyone in the room. The physicians who were dealing with these patients in 2010 and 2011 were working without a map, not because they weren't good at their jobs, because no map existed. MDPV was new enough and had spread fast enough that the toxicology literature was running several months behind what was showing up in emergency departments. The physicians were seeing the drug in people before they'd read about it in journals, which is generally the wrong order. They were calling poison control centres that were logging calls while simultaneously trying to generate information. Everyone was learning in real time from patients, which is the most stressful form of education available. The presentations were unlike what ER physicians had been trained for. A person in cocaine psychosis is agitated, paranoid, elevated, but the picture is recognizable. There is a framework. There are sedation protocols. There is a reasonable expectation that a moderate dose of a benzodiazepine will begin to calm things. MDPV patients were presenting in a different register entirely. Patients who needed to be physically restrained by multiple staff members. Patients with core temperatures high enough to require active cooling. Not just a cool environment, but ice packs, cooling blankets, the kind of measures you'd use for someone who'd been running a marathon in August. Patients whose blood pressure was behaving in ways that made cardiologists uncomfortable. The problem was that the drug that was producing all of this was also the drug that was making the patient absolutely certain that the people with the ice packs and the needles were a threat. Every intervention looked, from inside MDPV psychosis, like an attack. And because the pain system was compromised and the stress response was running at maximum, the patient's resistance to being helped was, in a pharmacological sense, completely sincere. Nobody in that room was wrong about their own reality. The patient was genuinely terrified. The staff were genuinely trying to help. The drug had made both of those things simultaneously true and completely incompatible. The first guidance that emerged was largely empirical. Higher doses of benzodiazepines were needed. Cooling measures mattered. MDPV raises body temperature significantly, and hypothermia becomes dangerous quickly, and patience was required. The drug would wear off eventually, and the patient would return. The word eventually was carrying a lot of weight. MDPV also had a geography to its early American spread that wasn't accidental. Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, the American South specifically, states with relatively permissive retail environments, significant populations without health insurance, limited public mental health infrastructure, and a head shop economy that had been operating for decades without particular interference. These were not chosen as target markets by anyone. There was no strategic plan. It moved where distribution channels existed and where oversight was thinnest. This is how all market-driven drug epidemics work. They find the gaps in the system and flow through them. The gaps in the American South in 2010 were significant. The Poison Control Center in Louisiana was fielding calls and trying to construct a picture from partial information. The calls were describing people who'd been found outside, sometimes naked, in summer heat, having been in a state of extended agitation. Calls about people who had gone to sleep after an apparent episode and hadn't woken up with normal vitals. Calls about people who had taken something at a party and were now somewhere inaccessible to reason and conventional sedation. The centers did what they could, which was gather data, issue guidance as that data allowed, and escalate the information to federal agencies that were, at this point, beginning to register that something significant was happening in the synthetic stimulant space. The media, which had been paying limited attention up to this point, began paying considerably more attention when the story acquired a face. May 26th, 2012, Miami. A causeway over the MacArthur Causeway in the afternoon sun. A man named Rudy Eugene was found attacking a homeless man named Ronald Poppo. The attack was horrific. Eugene was shot and killed at the scene by police. Poppo survived but lost most of his face, before any toxicology had been run. Within hours of the attack, the story was already circulating. Bath salts. Eugene had taken bath salts. This was why he had done what he did. This was the drug that caused cannibalism. Miami police made a statement suggesting bath salts as a possible explanation, which was a reasonable thing to say in the absence of toxicology. They were trying to explain something that defied ordinary explanation. The local media picked it up. The national media picked it up from the local media. Cable news ran with it through a full news cycle, then another, then another. Within 48 hours, bath salt zombie was a phrase that existed in common usage. The story travelled at the speed that things travel when they're alarming and explicable, and fit a narrative that was already forming. The bath salt compounds had been generating alarming reports for 2 years. The emergency room physicians had been raising flags. The poison control centres had been watching numbers rise. So when a story emerged that seemed to illustrate exactly what everyone had been warning about, violent, extreme, completely outside normal human behaviour, it snapped into place. The story confirmed what people already suspected. Confirmation is always a better traveller than complication. The toxicology came back 3 weeks later. Rudy Eugene had cannabis in his system. Cannabis and nothing else. No bath salts, no MDPV, no synthetic cathinones of any kind. The medical examiner stated this plainly. The updated information was reported accurately. It ran considerably further back in the newspaper than the original story, and at considerably lower volume, and by that point the bath salt zombie concept was already in the permanent record, in headlines, in congressional testimony, in the cultural understanding of what bath salts did to people. The factual correction existed. The myth was not listening. The congressional testimony is worth dwelling on. In the weeks and months after the Eugene case, politicians stood before committees and cited bath salts as a national emergency. The zombie narrative, the idea of drug-induced cannibalism, of people being transformed into something beyond restraint or reason, became a rhetorical device that served the scheduling legislation. It was genuinely useful. It created the emotional urgency that technical toxicology data rarely provides. That it rested on a case where the drug was absent was not, apparently, considered a problem. By the time anyone checked, the language was already in the bills. This is worth pausing on, because it matters to everything that follows. The bath salt zombie myth, specifically the idea that MDPV causes cannibalism and superhuman violence, became the dominant public narrative about the drug. It influenced legislation. It influenced how emergency services were trained to think about MDPV users. It influenced how the media would later cover monkey dust in the UK, reaching for the same zombie framing years later because the vocabulary had already been established. It influenced how the public understood who bath salt users were and what they were capable of, which in turn influenced how much sympathy those users could expect when things went wrong. All of that influence rested on a case where the drug wasn't present. This is a specific kind of tragedy, not the tragedy of something terrible that happened, but the tragedy of the story that formed around it. Rudy Eugene attacked Ronald Poppo, and the explanation, bath salt, zombie drug, pharmacological monster maker, was more emotionally satisfying than the reality, which is that human beings sometimes do terrible things without pharmacological assistance, and that the absence of an external explanation is much harder to sit with than the presence of one. MDPV is genuinely dangerous. It genuinely produces psychosis. It genuinely creates situations where agitated users behave in ways that are frightening to witness and difficult to manage. The actual pharmacology was alarming enough that no mythological enhancement was required. But the myth arrived first. And myths, once circulating, do not stop circulating because the evidence was wrong. They circulate because the story is good. The story of a drug that turns people into monsters is always a better story than a drug that produces a severe psychiatric emergency in vulnerable people who took a cheap compound with no safety data and no medical support nearby. One of those stories is easier to legislate against. One of those stories makes the users the problem, rather than the conditions that produce the use. Both of those things were useful, in 2012, for a government trying to respond to a drug crisis it had failed to anticipate. The legislation came. In June 2011, a full year before the Rudy Eugene case, which is worth noting, the DEA invoked its emergency scheduling authority. 3 synthetic cathinone chemicals were placed under temporary federal control: MDPV, mephedrone, and methylone. Emergency scheduling is a specific legal mechanism that lets the DEA act before the full legislative process completes. It buys time. It doesn't require the years of review that standard scheduling demands. It is, in practice, the government equivalent of changing the locks before you finish the paperwork. The head shop owners who had been selling Ivory Wave found themselves in a different situation overnight. The product that had been generating legitimate retail revenue was now a Schedule I substance, which meant that the packets on the shelves had become evidence. Some disposed of stock, some found themselves in legal trouble, some quickly pivoted to whatever the next compound was, and there was always a next compound because the research chemical space operates faster than the scheduling process can follow. The colourful packets disappeared from gas station shelves. In July 2012, Congress passed the Synthetic Drug Abuse Prevention Act, making the scheduling permanent. MDPV joined heroin and cannabis and LSD in the category of substances the federal government considers beyond redemption. Schedule I. No accepted medical use, high potential for abuse. The irony being that MDPV had once been considered for medical use by Boehringer Ingelheim in 1969, who had looked at it and decided it was too extreme. The federal government, 43 years later, arrived at the same conclusion through an entirely different process and with considerably more paperwork. The compound did not disappear. It had never needed the shelves. The shelves were a convenience, not a necessity. What moved it was chemistry and economics, and neither of those had been addressed. Scheduling is a specific kind of policy tool. It is, at its core, a signal. This substance is now a legal matter. Possession or distribution becomes a criminal offence. The pharmacology does not change. The demand does not change. The supply chain, if it is sufficiently motivated, finds alternative routes. The only thing that changes with certainty is where the transaction occurs and which populations bear the legal consequences. In the case of MDPV, the scheduling did accomplish something real. The retail market, head shops, gas stations, convenience stores, did close. The broad population of curious, legally minded first-time buyers who had purchased Ivory Wave because it was available and theoretically legal did, largely, stop buying it. The product's casual accessibility, which had been a significant part of its reach, was gone. These are not trivial effects, but they are effects that operate on the population least harmed by the drug's removal. People who try something once because it's on a shelf and legal will not mostly pursue it through criminal supply chains. The friction of illegality is enough. They move on to whatever is next. The scheduling works on them. What remained, post-scheduling, was demand from people for whom legal risk was not the primary consideration. People who were already operating outside the structures that respond to legal risk. People managing severe addiction. People with untreated mental illness using whatever was available. People for whom the question of scheduling was less pressing than the question of where they were sleeping tonight. Scheduling removed MDPV from the population that didn't need it that badly. It left it with the population that needed something desperately and had found the cheapest available version of relief. This is not a criticism of scheduling as a policy instrument. It is an observation about what it does and doesn't do. It is the beginning of a response, not the whole response. The problem is that in most jurisdictions and for most drugs in this period, scheduling arrived and the rest of the response didn't follow. The criminal penalties materialized. The treatment infrastructure did not expand proportionally. The housing and mental health services that might have addressed why people needed MDPV in the first place were, in the United Kingdom's case, being reduced at roughly the same time they were needed most. The drug was scheduled. The conditions producing its use were not addressed. These are different things. In 2018, in Staffordshire, the distance between them would become unmistakably visible. In the United Kingdom, the DEA's timeline didn't apply, but the logic of the story rhymed closely enough to be instructive. The UK had banned MDPV under the Misuse of Drugs Act in 2010, earlier than the American federal response, and had done so with the same general confidence that scheduling produces results. There was a period of disruption. The online vendors who had been selling synthetic cathinones to British customers had to find new compounds, new routes, or both. Some closed, some pivoted. The research chemical forums noted the change and began discussing alternatives. The supply didn't stop, it rerouted. Production shifted to labs in Eastern Europe and China that were operating with chemical precursors that were either still legal or simply beyond the immediate reach of the legislation. The finished product arrived through the post, packaged as something innocuous, in quantities small enough not to attract attention and large enough to be worth the shipping. It moved through the same informal networks that had distributed it before, minus the head shop front. The surface disruption was real. The underlying infrastructure was not touched. One thing that didn't change: the price. The £2 to £5 per dose price point that would eventually define monkey dust's market in the UK was not a product of the legal environment. It was a product of synthesis costs and import volume, and the basic economics of a drug that requires milligram dosing. Those economics didn't change when the Misuse of Drugs Act added MDPV to its list. They never changed. MDPV remained extraordinarily cheap to produce, and therefore extraordinarily cheap to buy, no matter what the law said about it. The customers, by this point, were changing. In the early years of the research chemical scene, MDPV had travelled through curious recreational users and online forum communities. People who had money to spend on novel experiences and the technical literacy to find them. People for whom the scheduling risk was a meaningful deterrent because they had things to lose. By 2013 and 2014, in the UK, it was finding a different population. Not curious, not chemically literate, not online, homeless, economically marginalised, with no better options and a budget that made the £2 price point not merely attractive but practically decisive. Here is what £2 buys in Staffordshire in 2017. Not a pint, not a packet of cigarettes, not quite a coffee at the place with a good coffee, not a bus fare across town, but MDPV. £2 for a dose of something that would keep you awake, keep the world at a manageable distance, and produce a brief period of something that felt, however distorted, however followed by catastrophe, like the opposite of lying on concrete in November in the Midlands with nowhere to go. The stimulant effect mattered in ways that required some unpacking. Sleeping rough is not safe. It requires a level of alertness that ordinary sleep doesn't allow. You cannot drift off deeply in a doorway in Stoke-on-Trent in February and expect to be fine. You need to maintain enough awareness to respond to what's around you. MDPV, at lower doses, provided something like that. Prolonged wakefulness, sustained alertness, the chemical equivalent of being on watch. That some users described this as a feature was not an irrational response to their circumstances. It was a rational response to circumstances that were themselves irrational. It had found its market. Not the market anyone had designed it for. Not the pharmaceutical patients of the 1960s who never received it. Not the curious recreational users of 2008 testing it with milligram scales and trip reports. Not even, really, the addicts of the early bath salt era in the American South, but a market that existed because of specific and documentable decisions made over decades in specific towns in the English Midlands. The closure of mines and factories, the reduction of mental health beds, the inadequacy of emergency housing provision, the gutting of the services that might have provided an alternative. Post-industrial Staffordshire hadn't always looked like this. There had been things to do, things to make, places to work, structures that held communities in some relationship with economic purpose. Those structures had been systematically dismantled in ways that the communities themselves had not chosen and had not recovered from. The drug didn't create the gap. The drug filled it. It arrived in Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent and Cannock and the satellite towns of the West Midlands, and it moved through those communities the way things move through communities when they're cheap, and the communities are tight-knit and enclosed, and contain people who have been cut off from the structures that normally provide reasons not to take something terrible for £2. Someone tried it. Someone told someone else. And somewhere in a park or a hostel doorway or an underpass, someone who had nothing tried something that cost almost nothing. And for a moment, a brief, chemically generated moment before everything went wrong, it felt like something. That was enough. It was more than enough. By 2018, Staffordshire Police had a new daily problem. The chief superintendent was about to go on television, and the word that would come to define this chapter of the story, the word that had no official etymology and no agreed origin, and had somehow attached itself perfectly to what MDPV did to people, was already circulating through the estates and the shelters and the emergency rooms of the Midlands. Nobody agreed on where the name came from. That's the first thing to understand about monkey dust. It arrived before anyone could agree on its etymology. The people who knew the drug had the name. The people who studied the drug were reconstructing it after the fact. Etymology in street drug naming is rarely tidy. Names surface in slang, attached to things that feel right, and calcify into usage before anyone thinks to document the moment of origin. The most likely explanation, that the name described the behaviour the drug produced, the frantic, uncoordinated, climbing and shrieking quality that extreme MDPV intoxication could produce, was the most widely accepted, which is different from being verified. Some said it came from the colour of the powder, greyish-brown, like something dug from the ground. Some said it was the monkey on your back, addiction's oldest idiom, combined with the powder form, monkey's dust, something that clings. Some said it just emerged. Drug names often do. They surface in the slang of particular communities and harden into currency through repetition, and by the time anyone tries to trace the origin, it's already too late. The name is everywhere, and the origin is nowhere. What mattered was what the name attached itself to. And in Staffordshire by 2017, it attached itself to something quite particular, a substance circulating primarily among homeless and extremely poor communities, visibly and dramatically different in its effects from anything those communities had encountered before, and increasingly visible to emergency services who were encountering it daily. The name did what names do. It made an abstract problem into a concrete one. Stoke-on-Trent is 5 cities that were federated into one in 1910, and have been gently arguing about it ever since. Burslem, Tunstall, Fenton, Longton, Hanley, the 6 towns of the Potteries, as the area is known, once made the ceramics that furnished half of Britain's. Dining tables, Wedgwood, Royal Doulton, Spode, names that meant something, brands that appeared in the homes of people who had never been to Staffordshire and never thought about it. The Potteries was not glamorous. Kiln work never is, but it was purposeful and legible. People went to work. Things were made. There was a relationship between effort and outcome, and between the town and the wider world that gave the place a function. The work was brutal if you want the full picture. Potter's rot, pneumoconiosis from silica dust ores was endemic. Life expectancy was low. The conditions were not romantic, but the industry was there, and the community structures that grow around shared labour held things together. The working men's clubs, the chapels, the particular solidarity of people who work alongside each other and understand each other's exhaustion. Then the industry contracted. Not overnight. not in a single catastrophic closure, more like a tide going out slowly enough that you kept adjusting your position on the beach, then suddenly enough that you looked around and the water was gone. The 1980s, the 1990s, the gradual shift of ceramic production to countries where labour cost less, the consolidations and the redundancies and the factories that became warehouses, then became empty, then became the subject of regeneration proposals that were approved and amended and eventually shelved. The employment that had structured generations of local life thinned out across 2 decades, until what remained was a fraction of what had been there. By the 2000s, Stoke-on-Trent had some of the highest rates of poverty, unemployment, and benefit dependency in England, consistently near the bottom of deprivation indices, the kind of town where the phrase "left behind" is technically accurate and completely inadequate in equal measure. Accurate because the economic abandonment is real and measurable, inadequate because it implies someone left when really the structures just dissolved around people who stayed. The people who stayed were still there in 2018. They were in the doorways, they were in the hostels, they were in the emergency rooms, they were on the end of the calls that Staffordshire Police was fielding at 5 a day. Into this landscape came the Psychoactive Substances Act of 2016. The Act was Parliament's attempt to solve the novel psychoactive substances problem once and for all. The logic was elegant, in the way that very broad solutions are often elegant. Rather than playing whack-a-mole with individual compounds as they appeared and were scheduled, simply ban all psychoactive substances not specifically exempted. Alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, medicines, exempted. Everything else, illegal. The designers of the Act were not idiots. They had watched the research chemical scene outmaneuver compound by compound scheduling for a decade, and they had drawn a reasonable conclusion. The problem was structural, and a structural solution was needed. If you ban all psychoactive substances, chemists cannot simply modify a side chain and produce a legal alternative. The whole category is covered. This was, in theory, correct. The practical implementation had some complications. The exemption categories required definition, defining psychoactive substances precisely enough that the law could be enforced, but not so broadly that it accidentally covered things like exercise, endorphins, religious practice, certain incense, or watching a particularly moving film, turned out to be exactly as difficult as you'd expect. A judicial review eventually found that poppers, alkyl nitrites, widely used in gay communities for their relaxant properties, had been accidentally caught by the Act's provisions, triggering a separate legislative correction. The Act had, in its sweep, briefly banned a product used in sexual contexts by a significant portion of the population who had not asked to be addressed by drug legislation. Nobody had meant to ban poppers. The Act was amended. The poppers returned to the shelves. The episode suggested that legislating against all psychoactive substances simultaneously was somewhat harder than it had sounded in the briefing document. For MDPV and monkey dust specifically, the Act arrived to address a problem that had already been addressed. MDPV had been scheduled under the Misuse of Drugs Act in 2010. The Psychoactive Substances Act added nothing to its legal status that wasn't already there. It was the equivalent of putting a second lock on a door that was already locked, while the people you were trying to keep out had come through the window. Parliament announced a solution to a problem that had already moved. The window in this case was postal services and international chemical precursor markets, and the Act contained no provision that made those meaningfully harder to use. The supply chain for monkey dust in Staffordshire in 2017 and 2018 looked like this. Precursor chemicals, the raw materials from which MDPV can be synthesized, were imported from China and in some cases India. The synthesis happened in small laboratories in Eastern Europe, primarily Poland and the Czech Republic, in facilities that were neither the sprawling cartel operations of television drama nor the improvised backyard labs of American methamphetamine mythology. They were workmanlike, small, competent, producing a product with reliable chemistry and a stable market. The finished powder was packaged in quantities measured in grams, a single gram containing many individual doses given MDPV's milligram potency, and shipped through standard postal services to addresses in the United Kingdom. Not in dramatic packaging, in envelopes, in the kind of plain, unremarkable postal items that pass through sorting offices at a volume so high that targeted inspection of suspicious packages is an exercise in finding particular grains of sand by examining individual grains on a beach. At the receiving end, a dealer. Not typically a sophisticated criminal organization with hierarchies and territories, and the kind of structure that generates intelligence for law enforcement. More often a person with a postal address, an online connection to a supplier, and a relationship with a community of buyers. The kind of operation whose footprint was small enough to be largely invisible to the tools that drug enforcement had developed for larger-scale supply chains, from there, hand to hand, person to person. Across the social networks of rough sleeping and temporary accommodation, and the particular geography of street life in a post-industrial English town, which is a geography of particular corners and doorways and benches, and of the people who return to them with the regularity of habit. A dealer supplying an encampment might be serving dozens of people from a single postal delivery. The markup was sufficient to make it worthwhile. The quantities involved, milligrams per dose, grams per supply, were small enough that a week's worth of product for a significant number of users could arrive in a standard envelope without triggering any automated threshold in the postal system. Forensic detection required specialist laboratory analysis, mass spectrometry, the kind of equipment that police forces don't carry in patrol cars, standard field drug tests, the chemical swab kits that officers use during searches did not reliably identify MDPV. A user found with the powder might be tested on the spot and produce an inconclusive or negative result. The drug that was overwhelming the emergency services was, in several procedural senses, effectively invisible to the first line of enforcement that encountered it. This is not an argument against enforcement. It is an observation about the characteristics that made monkey dust particularly difficult to interdict using the tools available. The supply chain was diffuse, low volume, postal, and forensically opaque. The demand it served was dispersed through communities that were already hard to reach with conventional services. The gap between the scale of the problem and the tools available to address it was significant in 2018 and did not close quickly. The communities where monkey dust took hold shared several characteristics. First, poverty severe enough that £2 was a meaningful decision, not a casual one. In communities where people were counting what they had, a £2 high was not the same as a £2 choice to be reckless. It was, for many users, the cheapest available alteration of a reality that was otherwise unalterable. Second, proximity. Monkey dust spread through contact, through shared supply networks, through the simple fact that if you're sleeping in the same doorway as someone who has it, you are near it. The drug did not require marketing, it required adjacency. In the enclosed social world of rough sleeping, where the same faces appeared in the same places with the same frequency, adjacency was guaranteed. Third, limited access to alternatives. Not no access. Limited access. Drug treatment services in Staffordshire, as in most of England, had seen budget reductions in the years following 2010. Not elimination, the services existed, but reduction. Waiting lists had grown. Bed capacity in detox and residential treatment had contracted. A person wanting to stop using monkey dust in Stoke-on-Trent in 2018 faced a queue, and in a drug with MDPV's pharmacology, a queue is a long time to wait. Fourth, a drug whose effects matched the circumstances. The stimulant properties kept users awake when sleeping rough was dangerous. The dissociation, however chaotic it became at higher doses, offered at least a brief interruption of circumstances that were otherwise uninterrupted. Even the compulsive redosing, as destructive as it was, had a logic inside the experience. The crash was so unpleasant, and the return to baseline reality so brutal, that another dose felt less like a choice and more like a necessity. These are not reasons to take monkey dust. They are the reasons people took it anyway. The social geography of Staffordshire's monkey dust epidemic was also shaped by something less tangible: community knowledge. Within the communities where it circulated, MDPV was understood imperfectly, but more accurately than anywhere in the media coverage. Users knew the redose trap. They warned each other. They had versions of the same harm reduction wisdom that the online research chemical communities had developed a decade earlier, transmitted not through forums but through conversation, through watching what happened to people, through the collective knowledge that accumulates in any community about the things in its environment. The vocabulary was different. The underlying information was similar. Don't take too much. Start small if you haven't used it for a while. Don't mix it with alcohol. If someone goes off, if someone crosses into the loud, climbing, disconnected state that was monkey dust's most visible presentation, stay nearby, keep them away from roads and heights. Don't restrain them unless absolutely necessary. Wait, some users specifically avoided higher doses, or tried to. Some treated their use the way people manage their relationship with any substance they know is dangerous, with rules, with limits, with varying success, with full awareness that the line was somewhere ahead and that crossing it had consequences. The communities using monkey dust were not uniformly ignorant about it. They were managing something they didn't have good options to stop, with the information and resources available to them. Most users at some point crossed the line anyway. The compulsive redose pattern that begins in euphoria and ends in something the word psychosis barely contains operated identically whether the user was a curious chemist in Hamburg in 2006 or a rough sleeper in Cannock in 2018. The pharmacology doesn't negotiate with biography. The dopamine transporter doesn't ask about your housing situation before deciding how to respond. What the drug did to the brain, it did regardless of who the brain belonged to. The difference was what came after. A person in Hamburg in 2006 in crisis after a bad MDPV experience had resources, a home to return to, probably a private doctor or a clinic with capacity to see them quickly, possibly friends with the knowledge and the presence of mind to help manage a stimulant crash. The recovery, however unpleasant, had a container. There were walls around it. A person in Cannock in 2018, in crisis after a bad monkey dust experience, had a doorway. And doorways are not containers. They are just the nearest available shelter from the wind. The doorway is not a metaphor. By 2018, the rough sleeping population in Staffordshire had grown significantly, the result of the same decade of austerity that had reduced treatment services and hollowed out the economic base. The numbers were not dramatic in absolute terms. Rough sleeping, as a phenomenon, is often invisible in official statistics because it is undercounted by definition. You cannot census people who don't have addresses. But the visible presence of rough sleepers in Stoke-on-Trent, in Cannock, in the town centres that emergency services were covering, had increased enough to be noticed. Rough sleepers are a small proportion of the population, but a large proportion of those most vulnerable to a drug like MDPV, for all the reasons already described: the price, the proximity, the circumstances that made the brief alteration feel like the only available one. The survival logic of staying awake when sleeping rough is dangerous. The social contagion of use spreading through enclosed communities where everyone knows what everyone else has. The crash so brutal that another dose isn't a desire but a defense. When someone in that population had a monkey dust episode, full psychosis, extreme agitation, the climbing and pacing behavioral presentation that emergency services were beginning to recognize and log, the resources available to respond were essentially emergency services, not a crisis housing bed available that afternoon, not a mental health crisis team with a response time measured in hours rather than days, not a detox facility with an open slot that week, police, paramedics, and ambulance crews. People who were trained for emergencies and had been trained for nothing quite like this one, who were now adapting their protocols in real time for a drug whose mechanism they were learning from the people experiencing it in a community whose circumstances had produced the crisis and would continue to produce it regardless of how well the protocols were adapted. The calls kept coming in, 5 a day, at the visible end. The moment the story became a public story came in the summer of 2018. Staffordshire Police's chief superintendent gave a series of media interviews describing what the force was seeing. The language was careful and alarmed in equal measure. 5 incidents a day. Users requiring multiple officers to manage as not because the force lacked training, but because the specific combination of pain insensitivity, extreme agitation, and complete dissociation from social consequence that MDPV produced meant that conventional techniques for managing a distressed individual were insufficient. Talking someone down requires that they can hear you. Restraint with minimal force requires that the person registers the force. Neither of those conditions reliably held during a monkey dust episode. The chief superintendent was not exaggerating. That's worth saying explicitly. In a story where the distance between official accounts and reality often turns out to be significant. The operational load was real. The challenge was real. 5 incidents a day, each potentially requiring multiple officers for extended periods, in a force serving an area with finite resources and no additional funding to address a drug crisis that was, from the perspective of central government, a local operational matter. The media arrived. Zombie drug was back. It had never quite left. The vocabulary established in the American bath salt coverage of 2012 had been waiting in the cultural archive, available for the next application, and monkey dust provided one. The tabloids ran with it. The broadsheets covered it more cautiously, but still reached for the zombie framing because the zombie framing was what people searched for, and what people searched for was what articles needed to be optimized for. The television coverage was stark. Footage of people in states of obvious distress, moving erratically, climbing structures, sitting in positions that suggested a complete absence of ordinary bodily awareness, interacting with things that weren't there. The images were real. They accurately represented what MDPV intoxication looked like from the outside. They were also decontextualized in ways that the format made almost unavoidable. 60 seconds of footage showing someone in psychosis does not structurally have room to explain that the person on screen is homeless because of housing policy, or that the drug costs £2 because of synthesis economics and global supply chains, or that the services that might have intercepted this person months ago had a waiting list measured in months. 60 seconds of footage shows a person behaving in a frightening way. The frightening behaviour fills the screen. The coverage was not wrong about what it showed. It was selective about what surrounded it. The pharmacology got some airtime. The supply chain got some coverage. The circumstances of the people using it, the housing crisis, the mental health service gaps, the concentration of economic disadvantage that had made this particular constellation of Midlands towns into the visible face of the problem, appeared, usually further down the article, where most people had already stopped reading. There was one question in 2018 that almost nobody in the coverage was asking, not, what is this drug and how does it work? That was being answered adequately by pharmacologists and public health researchers who understood MDPV's mechanism and were not short of material to work with. Not, what do we do about the people currently in crisis? That was being attempted imperfectly by services that were overwhelmed and under-resourced and making the best of a situation they had not been designed to handle at this scale. The question almost nobody was asking was simpler and harder. Why here? Why Staffordshire specifically? Why Stoke-on-Trent? Why Cannock? Why this particular constellation of post-industrial English Midlands towns, at this particular moment, had produced a drug epidemic of sufficient severity to require a chief superintendent to go on national television and describe it as a crisis? The drug was not unique to Staffordshire. It was present in other cities, other regions, other European countries. But the concentration was here, and the severity was here, and the question of why was embarrassingly easy to answer if you were willing to look at the deprivation statistics for the postcode areas where the incidents were occurring. The answer was not complicated. It was just inconvenient. The people using monkey dust were using it because they were homeless, or nearly homeless, or economically stranded in a way that made £2 feel like the only available option. The homelessness was not a random occurrence. It was the outcome of specific housing policies and the erosion of safety nets across a particular decade. The £2 option existed because MDPV's synthesis economics made it uniquely cheap at scale. The emergency services were overwhelmed because the alternative services, the ones that might have intercepted people before the crisis, had been reduced at precisely the moment they were most needed. All of that was traceable. All of it was documented. Some of it was even acknowledged in policy documents that sat in the same government buildings where the press conferences about monkey dust were being prepared. None of it fit in a headline. Zombie drug terrorizes Staffordshire fit in a headline. It was specific, alarming, and actionable in the sense that something should be done, even if the something wasn't named. And so that was the headline, and the people in the doorways kept being in the doorways, and the emergency services kept adapting their protocols, and the calls kept coming in at 5 a day, which was both a large number and an undercount, and which would keep coming until something changed. Something was about to change, but not in the way the headline suggested. What changed in the summer and autumn of 2018 was not the drug. It was doing exactly what it had always done. The pharmacology was stable, the supply chain was stable, the communities most affected were, if anything, more deeply embedded in their circumstances than they had been a year before. The incidents were occurring at the same rate. The ER presentations were following the same pattern. The operational challenges for emergency services had not meaningfully changed. What changed was visibility. The chief superintendent's media appearances had done something that 5 incidents a day, tallied in operational logs and discussed in internal briefings, had not managed to do. They had made the crisis legible to people who were not in Staffordshire. They had given it a name that travelled: monkey dust, zombie drug, and a scale that demanded response. The coverage cascaded outward. Regional television first, then the national newspapers which ran the story with the particular energy that drug panics generate in British tabloids, large fonts, stark images, the vocabulary of threat and disorder that has served this genre since at least the 1980s. Then the international wire services, which picked it up because the phrase zombie drug and the word Staffordshire were an unusual combination, and unusual combinations generate clicks in countries that cannot find Stoke-on-Trent on a map, but are quite willing to read about it for 3 minutes. The response arrived in the form that responses to drug crises usually arrive, with urgency, with press conferences, with working groups and statements of concern and the particular political energy that media attention generates, and with considerably more attention than resources. What the emergency services actually needed was less complicated than the headline suggested. They needed accurate information about what they were dealing with, not the zombie framing, but the pharmacology. They needed protocols, calibrated to MDPV's actual mechanism rather than generic stimulant psychosis guidelines. They needed the people on the front line, officers, paramedics, hospital staff, to have enough working knowledge of the drug that their interventions matched the actual situation rather than the imagined one. Because the zombie framing, however effective at generating coverage, was operationally counterproductive in ways that mattered on the street. Here is what monkey dust actually looked like from the outside, according to the paramedics and police officers who encountered it most. Not superhuman strength. Something more precise and harder to manage than that. A person in full MDPV psychosis was not physically stronger than normal. Their grip was not vice-like. They could not lift cars or break handcuffs. The impossible to restrain presentation that had become shorthand for monkey dust in the media required a more precise description. A person who was responding to a reality, invisible to everyone else, who had no functional awareness that restraint was happening, who was not building up the internal resistance that pain normally creates, and who was therefore not naturally reaching the point of exhaustion that brings most physical struggles to an end. Normal human restraint situations have a curve. Resistance escalates, peaks, and then, as pain and exhaustion accumulate in the body being restrained, and as the social information of the situation filters through, begins to reduce. The person being restrained reaches a threshold where stopping becomes preferable to continuing. This is how almost every physical confrontation ends. Eventually, the body votes for stillness. MDPV patients did not reliably reach that threshold on the normal schedule. Not because the pain wasn't happening, it was. The nerve endings were functioning correctly. The physical feedback from restraint was being generated and transmitted. But the signal was arriving at a brain that was already running at maximum capacity on other inputs. Threat assessment, environmental monitoring, the processing of information that existed only internally, and the pain signal did not have access to the priority queue. The person being restrained was not experiencing a failure of pain reception. They were experiencing a failure of pain prioritization. The pain existed. It was simply less important than everything else that was happening, from inside the experience, than it would normally be. This is why it took multiple officers. This is the whole, undramatic pharmacological explanation. Not superhuman strength. Not zombie transformation. A person whose normal feedback mechanisms had been temporarily overridden, combined with a human body's genuinely significant capacity for physical resistance when it is not being modulated by the usual limiting signals. That combination required more people to manage safely than a typical situation, 5 officers sometimes, because the pharmacology demanded it, not because the person was more than human, because MDPV had temporarily removed one of the things that makes humans manageable. The paramedics who responded to monkey dust calls developed, through experience, a working knowledge of what they were looking at. Elevated body temperature, present. The thermometer reading that prompted the cooling measures. Ice packs applied to pulse points. The patient moved away from sun or heat sources that had become standard in MDPV responses because hypothermia was one of the more medically immediate risks. A person whose body temperature was climbing while their temperature regulation system was simultaneously being overridden by extreme stimulant activity was in a situation that required cooling, whether or not the patient cooperated with the cooling. They often didn't cooperate with the cooling. The ice pack applied to the neck of a person convinced they were under attack registered in the patient's experience as exactly the kind of threatening physical contact they were trying to escape. The paramedic attempting to reduce a dangerous core temperature and the patient attempting to escape a perceived threat were operating in the same physical space with completely incompatible maps of it. Pulse, elevated to the point where the question was not just sedation but cardiac monitoring. MDPV's norepinephrine activity pushed the cardiovascular system hard. A heart rate at the high end of what MDPV produced, sustained over hours of repeated dosing and physical exertion during a psychotic episode, put meaningful strain on a cardiovascular system that might already be compromised by the poverty and lifestyle circumstances that often accompanied rough sleeping. The paramedics were not dealing with healthy people in acute drug crises. They were dealing with people whose baseline health was often already compromised in drug crises that were more extreme than most of their training had prepared them for. The combination was not ideal from any perspective. The specific incident that circulated most widely in the coverage, the one that became the image people reach for when explaining what monkey dust did, involved a user climbing the exterior of a building. The details vary by account. The building's height varies depending on which report you read. The location varies. The circumstances that preceded the climb, what the person had taken, how much, over what period, vary. What does not vary across accounts? A person, during a monkey dust episode, ascending the outside of a structure without ropes, without equipment, without any apparent awareness of either the height or the physical risk, not recklessly, not suicidally. Responding to the situation as it existed inside the episode, rather than the situation as it existed in external reality. When the person was brought down by emergency services with the particular care that the situation required, which is to say enormous care applied with urgency, there was no apparent awareness that anything unusual had happened. Not suppressed awareness, not bravado, no awareness. The climb had occurred inside a different version of events. In that version, climbing was necessary. It was the correct response to whatever was happening. The external reality, height, danger, spectators, the paramedics below, did not exist in the version the person was inhabiting. The medical description of what produces this is not exotic. During severe stimulant psychosis, the brain's threat assessment system is running at maximum, processing information that is being generated internally rather than received from the environment. The person is responding correctly. The response is logical, even, to a set of conditions that exist entirely within their own neurochemistry. The zombie framing consistently missed this. Zombies, in the cultural imagination, are empty. Their behavior is automatic, unthinking, driven by nothing resembling cognition. MDPV psychosis was the opposite. A mind at maximum output, processing urgently, making decisions, solving problems, just solving the wrong problems, with wrong information, in a reality that didn't correspond to the one everyone around them could see. The person on the building thought they were doing something necessary. That is the part that doesn't make it into the headline. The paramedic's eye view of a monkey dust response pieced together from accounts that emerged in the 2018 coverage and from medical literature on stimulant psychosis looked roughly like this. You arrive. The person is mobile, possibly moving quickly, possibly in a position that creates immediate safety concerns. Your first task is containment. Prevent the person from entering traffic, from accessing height, from injuring themselves in the ways that are most immediately available to someone who is not receiving environmental feedback normally. You do not, if you have experience with MDPV, attempt to talk them down in the way you might talk down a person in alcohol-related distress. The mechanism is different. A person in alcohol-related distress can often be reached by a calm voice, by the social relationship between paramedic and patient, by the appeal to shared reality. A person in MDPV psychosis is not in shared reality. The calm voice is registered as sound. Whether it produces meaning is less certain. Whether it produces meaning that overrides what is currently happening internally is very unlikely. You take the temperature, rectal temperature in a field situation, because surface temperature doesn't tell you what you need to know about core temperature. The reading is high, higher than high. You apply what cooling you can. The patient objects to the cooling vigorously. You request police support if it isn't already present, because the next phase of this, IV access, sedation, monitoring, requires the patient to be sufficiently contained that you can do it safely. IV access in a person who is actively resisting your presence is not impossible. It is considerably harder than IV access in a person who knows you're trying to help them. The police provide containment. You provide sedation at doses higher than standard, watching the respiratory rate with the close attention that higher benzodiazepine doses require. You monitor the cardiac trace, because the cardiovascular system has been under load, and load reveals underlying vulnerabilities that didn't matter yesterday and matter now. Then you wait. You wait for the drug to do what drugs eventually do, which is leave. The body metabolizes it. The dopamine flood recedes. The threat assessment system begins to receive environmental data again rather than generating its own. The person starts to become gradually legible again. They're exhausted. They're confused. They often have no memory of some or all of what happened. They're also typically still in the circumstances that led to the monkey dust use in the first place, minus whatever physical harm may have occurred during the episode, and you have another call waiting. The emergency rooms that received monkey dust patients in 2018 faced a catch-22 that had been identified in American emergency departments in 2011 and had not, in the intervening years, become easier to resolve. Sedation was needed, the level of agitation, the cardiovascular strain, the risk of hypothermia, the risk of the patient injuring themselves or staff during prolonged psychosis. All of these required that the patient be sedated. This was not a judgment about the patient. It was a medical necessity in the same way that sedation before surgery is a medical necessity. MDPV patients required significantly higher doses of sedatives than most drug-related presentations. The dopamine system was flooded to a degree that normal sedative doses couldn't overcome. Higher doses of benzodiazepines brought the required sedation, but higher doses of benzodiazepines also increased the risk of respiratory depression. The patient stops breathing adequately, which is the outcome medical sedation is most carefully designed to avoid. Higher doses to sedate. Higher doses risk respiratory compromise. Monitor more carefully. Intervene faster if respiratory function drops. But the patient requiring that level of monitoring needs a monitored bed, and monitored beds are finite. The catch-22 of MDPV treatment existed in the gap between what the drug required and what the healthcare system had the capacity to provide. Emergency departments that were already running at capacity, because emergency departments in England in 2018 were structurally operating beyond what was comfortable, absorbing MDPV cases that required extended monitoring, repeated assessment, and sedation protocols that demanded close observation, found the math increasingly strained. There was no MDPV-specific medication, no pharmacological rescue, no drug that blocked MDPV's receptor, binding the way naloxone blocks opioid overdose. You waited for it to leave. In the meantime, the patient was in a full internal emergency, requiring resources that the system had not been scaled to provide. What came after the intoxication was, in its own way, as difficult as the intoxication. The crash. A person who had used MDPV heavily, redosing across hours, which was the standard pattern rather than the exception, because the compulsive redose dynamic that had been documented in every context where this drug appeared did not spare the rough sleeping population of the English Midlands, came down into a state that the word crash inadequately describes. Profound depression. Not the ordinary low mood that follows stimulant use. the kind that resolves with food and sleep, a neurological state in which the dopamine system, having been pushed far beyond its normal operating range, was now running well below it. The brain's reward machinery, which had been firing at maximum for an extended period, was now doing the opposite of firing. The technical term is dopamine depletion. The experiential description is simpler. Nothing feels like anything. Everything was grey, flat, without point. The things that normally carry small motivational charges, warmth, food, conversation, the prospect of something better, tomorrow, carried nothing. The dopamine system is the system that generates the sense that things matter. When it is temporarily depleted, things temporarily do not matter, and the sense that they will ever matter again is also temporarily absent, because that sense is generated by the same system. Sleep, when it came, was not restorative in the ordinary sense. The body was exhausted. The neurochemistry required time, days, in some cases, to return to anything approximating baseline. During that time, the world offered nothing that MDPV had, hours earlier, briefly provided, and the contrast between those two states, the brief, intense biochemical sense that everything was available and significant, followed by the flatness of depletion, was not subtle. It was the widest gap most users had ever experienced between two consecutive states of being. The cravings that accompanied the crash were not a desire for pleasure. They were a response to the acute neurological misery of MDPV withdrawal, the flatness, the grey, the sense that the normal world was now inaccessible. Another dose would not return everything to normal. It would return everything to the elevated abnormal, but elevated abnormal felt, from inside the crash, like a return to something real. This is the trap, not a metaphor. An actual pharmacological mechanism by which the drug creates the conditions for its own continued use, in a population that had limited access to alternatives and every reason to want the flatness to end. The people who could not stop were not failing to exercise willpower. They were inside a feedback loop that had been built in circumstances that provided no exit. The deaths associated with monkey dust were fewer than the severity of the crisis might have suggested. This is worth saying accurately. MDPV, direct overdose deaths, cases where the drug alone, at toxic doses, caused death, were documented but not common. MDPV has a stimulant, ceiling effect at very high doses, but the practical risks of extreme MDPV intoxication were less likely to kill directly and more likely to create the conditions for death by other means. The building climbers who fell, the users in psychosis who stepped into traffic, the people whose cardiovascular systems, already compromised, couldn't sustain the extended strain. The users who combined monkey dust with alcohol or other depressants, producing a combination toxicity that was considerably more lethal than either substance alone. The people who, during the crash, in the flat grey aftermath, made decisions that were shaped by the neurological state the drug had left behind. The coroner's report that names MDPV is the easy case. The deaths that belong to monkey dust without being named by it are harder to count and considerably more numerous. The community members who had been watching people use monkey dust for months could name people by name. The emergency services who had been responding to incidents could name the incidents. The beds in homeless hostels that turned over with an unusual frequency in 2018, the gap where a person used to be, that was being counted by people, just not in the official statistics. The official statistics were the visible waterline. The people below it were being counted in other ways, in communities that had learned to expect this kind of counting. The treatment question, in 2018, had a simpler answer than anyone wanted to say out loud. There was no specific treatment for MDPV addiction, no medication that targeted the mechanism, no pharmacological tool that made the craving manageable, the way methadone or buprenorphine do for opioid dependence. The receptor systems involved, dopamine, norepinephrine, were not well served by the existing pharmacological toolkit for addiction, which had been built primarily around opioids and alcohol. Bupropion, an antidepressant that works on the same norepinephrine and dopamine systems, was occasionally used off-label, the reasoning being that something which acts on the same pathways might smooth the crash and reduce craving. The evidence was thin. The practice existed because it was the nearest available option, not because the evidence supported it confidently. What worked, to the extent anything worked, was what always works and always costs more than a prescription: housing, mental health support, economic stability, the removal of the circumstances that had produced the use in the first place, the conditions that made monkey dust the rational choice for £2. If those conditions changed, the rational calculation changed. They did not, in 2018, change. The treatment services that existed, and they did exist, understaffed and under-resourced but present, were offering what they could: detox support, counselling, referrals to housing services whose waiting lists were long. The people running those services were not the people who had cut their budgets. They were working with what remained after the cutting, which was less than what had been there before, at a moment when what was needed was more. The gap between the scale of the crisis and the resources available to address it was not a mystery. It was a budget line. Several budget lines, across several years, accumulating into the operational reality that Staffordshire's emergency services were managing in 2018 with the tools that hadn't been cut. The police officers who were responding to monkey dust incidents 5 times a day were not, for the most part, asking political questions about why this was happening. They were doing their jobs, which is what the situation required. A person in psychosis on a Stoke Street corner in November did not need someone arriving with policy analysis. They needed someone to arrive quickly, keep them safe, and manage the situation until the pharmacology moved on. The officers were doing that, adapting their approach as they learned, developing the institutional knowledge that accumulates in any organisation that faces the same problem repeatedly. What they were also doing, whether or not they framed it this way, was providing a service that existed because other services didn't. The crisis housing that might have intercepted this person months ago, short. The mental health crisis team that might have responded at the first sign of escalating use, stretched. Drug treatment services that might have offered an alternative when the use was still manageable, waiting list. The economic support that might have made £2 feel less like the only option, reduced. So the police arrived. Because the police always arrive when everything else has already not arrived. That is not a criticism of the police. It is a description of what happens when the crisis services are funded and the preventive services are not. The crisis becomes the service, the emergency becomes the normal, and the people managing the emergency, 5 calls a day, every day, in a former pottery town in the English Midlands, do their jobs with the tools they have, which is what they did, and what the people in the doorways did when the police had gone and the ambulance had left and the episode had passed and the crash had settled, was get up and do what people do when the options available to them haven't changed. They looked for what they needed, at £2 a time. The chief superintendent went on television again in 2019, not to declare victory, not to announce that the situation had resolved. The situation had not resolved. What had happened was that it had been absorbed by the emergency services, by the treatment sector, by the communities affected, into the category of ongoing problem rather than acute crisis. The 5 incidents a day became the operational baseline. Protocols were developed. Training was updated. The drug became, in the institutional sense, known. The chaos of the unknown had become the managed difficulty of the familiar. This is genuine progress. It is also a very low bar for what progress ought to mean when people are still sleeping in doorways and still reaching for £2 relief from circumstances that haven't changed. The emergency services had learned to manage the crisis. The crisis had not learned to manage itself out of existence. The language in the 2019 interviews had shifted from alarm to procedural, calm. In 2018, the vocabulary had been reaching for frameworks that didn't quite fit because the situation was new. By 2019, there were protocols, there was training, there was an operational understanding of what MDPV intoxication looked like and what it required. The drug had been integrated into the institutional knowledge of Staffordshire's emergency services in the way that any persistent hazard eventually gets integrated, not neutralised, just categorised. This is not the same as improvement. It is the point at which improvement stops feeling urgently necessary, because the emergency has been bureaucratised into a chronic condition. The calls kept coming. The drug kept arriving by post. The communities where it circulated continued to be the communities where it circulated, because the circumstances that had produced those communities had not changed in any material way. There was a moment in the 2019 coverage that followed the renewed media interest, where a question cut closer to the centre of things than most of the coverage had managed. The question was approximately, what would actually make this stop? The answers were various. Better treatment services, more outreach workers in the communities where monkey dust circulated, earlier intervention, harm reduction approaches, drug checking services that would let users know what was actually in what they were taking, needle exchanges, places to go that weren't the street, housing. The list of things that would help was not short and was not secret. It was the standard evidence-based list that drug policy researchers had been compiling and updating for the better part of 2 decades, in reports that used careful language and cited robust data, and recommended approaches that consistently received insufficient funding. Someone asked how much it would cost. The answer was considerably less than the cost of managing the crisis through emergency services alone once you ran the numbers. Ambulance, call-outs, emergency department presentations, police response hours at 5 incidents a day, custodial costs for the people whose monkey dust use intersected with the criminal justice system, the downstream costs of not intervening earlier, which compound over time in ways that are expensive to model and expensive to ignore. Prevention is cheaper than crisis management. This has been true in health, in housing, in mental health, in drug treatment, across multiple systems and multiple countries and multiple decades of data. The accounting is not complicated. The political economy of acting on it is considerably more so. The funding for prevention did not arrive in amounts that match the accounting. This is also always the answer. Across the Atlantic, the American MDPV story had by this point already produced a sequel, Alpha PVP. The drug that replaced MDPV in the American market after the 2012 scheduling was, in pharmacological terms, a close relative. Another synthetic, cathinone. Another potent dopamine and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. Another compound with the same compulsive redose mechanism, the same capacity for acute psychosis at higher doses, the same resistance to normal sedation doses in emergency settings, and the same price point that made it accessible to populations who would not have been able to afford cocaine at market rates. It had been synthesized earlier. It was in the same family of compounds. When MDPV became a Schedule I substance in the United States, the chemical precursors and the synthesis knowledge and the distribution infrastructure that had served the bath salt market didn't disappear. They looked for the next viable compound. Alpha PVP was available and had enough novelty that it cleared the scheduling lag that had trapped MDPV. Alpha PVP acquired a street name, Flakka, primarily in Florida, primarily in 2014 and 2015, primarily among low-income populations in Broward County, Fort Lauderdale, and its surrounding areas, where it was cheap and available and doing, in a slightly different molecular configuration, most of what MDPV had done in Louisiana and Mississippi 3 years earlier. The emergency rooms of Fort Lauderdale received alpha PVP patients who looked, to the staff, almost exactly like the MDPV patients their colleagues had described from 2011. The same running-in-place agitation, the same building climbing, the same aggression during restraint that was pharmacologically rather than intentionally driven, the same resistance to normal sedation, the same core temperature elevation that required active cooling, the same vivid, internally consistent paranoid delusions, the same stories the patients told when they became coherent enough to tell them about what they had been running from. The stories were different in their content. The mechanism was identical. The DEA scheduled alpha PVP in 2014, 2 years after it had emerged, 1 year after the Flakka nickname had already attached itself in Florida. The scheduling lag, which had been one of the defining features of the MDPV crisis, reproduced itself with alpha PVP almost exactly. Flakka declined in Florida by 2016. The reasons were multiple: scheduling, law enforcement pressure, improved detection, but also, significantly, community word of mouth. The kind of informal information sharing that moves faster than any government bulletin. People who had watched what alpha PVP did over weeks and months shared that information. The stories got around. The reputation of the drug preceded new supplies in some communities in ways that reduced uptake. This is harm reduction in its most informal possible register. Community knowledge, transmitted through conversation, functioning as an informal deterrent. It worked, partially, in that context. The compound went elsewhere, into European markets, into populations where the word hadn't yet gotten around, where the supply chain arrived before the reputation did. Alpha PVP did not disappear. It redistributed, as these compounds always do, toward the populations least positioned to hear the warnings, and most positioned to be in circumstances where £2 worth of anything felt like a reasonable option. The lesson that this sequential crisis should have taught: MDPV scheduled, Flakka emerges, Flakka scheduled, next compound waits in the wings, already synthesized, already moving through distribution channels, already unnamed and therefore unlisted, was visible in the data by the mid-2000s. Every researcher paying attention to the novel psychoactive substances market had said, in various formulations, the same thing. Scheduling individual compounds does not end demand. It displaces it. The synthetic chemistry toolkit is large enough, and the financial incentive strong enough, and the regulatory lag consistent enough, that new compounds will always be available before the legislation catches up. The compounds emerge faster than the hearings can be scheduled. The hearings are scheduled faster than the legislation can be passed. The legislation passes faster than the enforcement can be implemented. And in the gaps between those things, which are not small gaps, which are gaps measured in months and years, people are using whatever has arrived most recently. This is not a new observation. It was not a secret in 2014, or 2016, or 2018. It appeared in the reports of the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction. It appeared in the publications of Transform Drug Policy Foundation. It appeared in the academic literature on novel psychoactive substances, which expanded rapidly in this period because the subject matter was expanding rapidly, and researchers were doing what researchers do when something alarming is happening, which is study it carefully and publish their findings in journals that policymakers do not read. It appeared in government advisory documents. The Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, the UK's statutory body for advising on drug policy, said versions of this in its reports. The advice was received, the advice was considered, the compound-by-compound scheduling continued, not because the evidence supported it as the most effective approach, because it was the approach that produced press releases. Scheduling a compound is an event. It has a date. It has a minister standing at a podium. It has a statement that can be read out in the House of Commons. It demonstrates action in a form that is legible to a news cycle and accountable to a parliamentary question. The alternative approaches housing provision, treatment infrastructure, economic development in the communities where drug crises concentrate, the slow structural work of reducing the conditions that make £2 drugs a rational proposition, do not produce events. They produce trends. Trends are harder to announce. They are harder to claim credit, for in the constituency newsletter, they take longer than an electoral cycle to become visible in the data, so the scheduling continued, the compounds continued to emerge, the populations most affected continue to be the populations with the least ability to advocate for different approaches in communities with the least political leverage over the decisions being made about them. This is the mechanism by which drug policy consistently fails the people it most needs to help, not malice, not conspiracy. The ordinary incentive structures of democratic politics applied to a problem that those incentive structures are particularly poorly suited to solve. In the United Kingdom, as of the early 2020s, monkey dust remained detectable, not at the peak volumes of 2018. The crisis had receded from the level that required national media attention, which is a different thing from having been resolved. It is worth being precise about this distinction, because no longer in the news, and no longer happening, have historically been confused in ways that matter for the people still experiencing the thing that is no longer in the news. Drug testing services, WEDINOS in Wales, drug checking services operating in various English cities under harm reduction frameworks, continue to identify MDPV in submitted samples. Emergency services in the Midlands continued to encounter it, at lower frequency than the 2018 peak, but with a regularity that indicated ongoing use in the communities where it had established itself. The drug had become, in those communities, a known quantity, a familiar hazard, the way ice on a particular corner in January becomes a familiar hazard, not less dangerous for being expected, but differently categorized. Treatment services had adapted in real and meaningful ways. Staffordshire's drug treatment infrastructure, delivered through a combination of NHS services and commissioned third sector providers, had developed dedicated guidance for MDPV presentations. The knowledge that had not existed in 2018, when paramedics and emergency physicians were learning from patients in real time, had been accumulated, organised and disseminated. The acute management protocols were better. The pathway from crisis presentation to ongoing support was clearer, if not always well-resourced enough to follow. The rough sleeping population in Stoke-on-Trent and the surrounding area had not materially changed in ways that affected the fundamental economics of monkey dust use. The housing crisis that had contributed to the 2018 epidemic was an ongoing feature of the English housing landscape, rather than a temporary condition that had since been addressed. The mental health service capacity across the Midlands remained strained in the particular way that mental health service capacity across England had been strained for most of a decade. Not uniformly absent, not comfortably adequate, living in the difficult middle that produces waiting lists measured in months, and gaps between need and provision that swallow people whole. The drug found these gaps and filled them, as it always had. At £2, it remained the cheapest available answer to circumstances that had not gotten cheaper. The question of whether monkey dust use would re-escalate depended, as it had always depended, less on what law enforcement did, and more on whether the conditions producing it changed. The drug treatment sector had been asking this question for years, in various forms, in reports and briefings and evidence sessions, with a consistent experience of being heard and not funded to the degree that would have made a material difference. The reports continued to be written, the evidence sessions continued to be held, the gap between the evidence and the resource allocation continued to be the place where people fell. the Boehringer-Ingelheim patent. It is worth returning to it before this story ends. The researchers who synthesized MDPV in 1969, their names are not prominently attached to this compound in the available literature. This is the kind of chemistry that gets done by teams rather than celebrated as individual achievement. We're doing what pharmaceutical chemists do. They were testing compounds within a research program, looking for something useful, exploring the parameter space of a compound class to find where the therapeutically interesting territory was. They found something outside that territory, more potent than useful, too extreme for the purposes at hand, and they did what you do in that situation. They documented it, filed the documentation, and moved on to the next compound. The documentation became the patent. The patent became a record that sat in the archive, technically public, practically invisible, for 35 years. The intent was orderly, the outcome was not. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly in the history of drug crises. The gap between the intent of the original synthesis and the eventual use of the compound is enormous, and nobody travelling in either direction across that gap has any particular view of the other end. The Boehringer-Ingelheim researchers were not thinking about rough sleepers in Stoke-on-Trent. The rough sleepers in Stoke-on-Trent were not thinking about the researchers. Both groups were responding to the circumstances immediately in front of them, separated by 5 decades and a distance of several hundred miles, connected by a filing cabinet and an open-access database, and the economic conditions that made one group's discarded data point into another group's cheapest available option. The pharmaceutical industry across the 20th century synthesized an enormous number of compounds in a similar position to MDPV, tested, found unsuitable for commercial development for reasons of efficacy or toxicity or market size, filed. Some of those compounds are pharmacologically inert at street doses. Some are pharmacologically interesting in ways that wouldn't support a therapeutic use but would support a recreational one. Some are dangerous in ways that would be commercially viable on a street market, if the supply chain and the demand and the regulatory lag aligned. The databases containing these compounds are still searchable. The synthesis chemistry is largely available in the same documents. The same process that produced MDPV's journey from Pharmaceutical Archive to Staffordshire Street has not been interrupted. The next compound may already be identified, already moving through the early stages of the research chemical market, already acquiring a user base in some online community where the first draft reports are being written in the same careful tone that preceded the MDPV reports. Nobody knows which compound it is. Or they know, and the knowledge hasn't reached the right people yet. Or the right people know and can't act quickly enough. The lag is structural. The lag is probably permanent. The patent Boehringer-Ingelheim, filed in 1969, was not the last patent of its kind. It was one of many, in a catalogue that continues to grow as pharmaceutical research continues, and as the gap between synthesized and commercially viable continues to generate a steady supply of documented, tested, shelved compounds. The drawer is large, it has always been large, and it is not locked. The thread that runs through every chapter of this story is the same: not strength, removal. MDPV does not give people superhuman abilities. It takes away the feedback systems that normally tell people when to stop. It removes the signal that says, enough, physiologically in the pain system, neurologically in the reward system, behaviorally in the cascade from craving to redose to psychosis. The override doesn't add, it subtracts. And what it subtracts is the one mechanism that human beings most rely on to navigate a world that is otherwise full of things that could kill them if pursued too far. Most drugs of abuse add something. They add pleasure, or relief, or the sense of capability, or the cessation of pain. The addition is the thing that makes them sought. MDPV does add briefly. The first dose euphoria is real, and it is the reason anyone takes a second dose. But what makes MDPV distinctive as a compound, what gives it its character among the dozens of synthetic cathinones that have appeared in the novel psychoactive substances market, is the efficiency with which it then removes the ability to assess risk accurately, removes the sensation of pain as a stopping signal, removes the internal governor on the redose impulse, removes the ordinary social awareness that connects a person to the environment around them. By the time a person is in full MDPV psychosis, what is left is activity without feedback, motion without modulation, a system running without a regulator. The story of how this drug came to be in a Staffordshire doorway is also a story about removal. The removal of industries from specific towns, the removal of safety nets from specific populations, the removal of mental health bed capacity that had been reduced in successive rounds of efficiency savings, the removal of funding from housing provision that might have kept people off the streets where the drug circulated, the removal of drug treatment resources at the precise moment when the people who needed them most were accumulating in the same postcodes. The compound that Boehringer Ingelheim filed away in 1969 found, 40 years later, a market that had been shaped precisely by what had been taken away, not by the compound, by the people who took things away from people who could not stop them taking. The pharmacology and the policy history rhyme, which is either deeply meaningful or completely coincidental depending on how you feel about these things. What is not coincidental is the outcome. There is one more thing the Boehringer Ingelheim patent tells us, which is that it isn't over. MDPV sat in a filing cabinet for 35 years before someone opened it. The pharmaceutical industry across the 20th century synthesized an enormous number of compounds that were tested, found unsuitable for commercial development, and filed. Some of those compounds are dangerous. Some are dangerous in ways that would be commercially viable on a street market. If the right supply chain existed and the right demand existed and the right regulatory lag existed, the patent databases are still searchable, the supply chains are still present. The synthesis knowledge for MDPV is available to anyone with a chemistry background to use it. It is in the same documents that have always contained it, which are now more accessible than they have ever been. The precursor chemicals are available through the same international supply networks that have been serving this market since before MDPV had a street name. The distribution infrastructure, postal, small volume, forensically difficult to detect, has not been dismantled. It has been used for subsequent compounds and can be redirected when the market calls for it. The economic conditions that produce demand for cheap psychoactive substances in marginalized communities have not been resolved. They have been managed to varying degrees in ways that represent genuine effort and genuine inadequacy in roughly equal measure. The gap between what the research says would help and what the budget says is available has not closed. If anything, across the period covered by this story it has widened. So the compound waits, as compounds wait, patiently in the way that molecules are patient, which is to say completely, without effort, without agenda, simply persisting in whatever conditions allow persistence. The Boehringer Ingelheim researchers filed their work in 1969 and moved on to the next compound on the list. They were right to do so. MDPV was too extreme for medicine. They had no way of knowing that too extreme for medicine was not the same as too extreme for the street. They had no way of knowing that the gap between those two categories was in fact quite specific. It was the gap where desperation lived, where the price mattered more than the risk, where the £2 cost of brief relief from circumstances that had been made unbearable by a series of decisions made far away and long ago was the most important variable in the equation. Nobody filed the patent thinking that. Nobody scheduled it thinking it would be replaced within 2 years by something functionally identical. Nobody, built the supply chain thinking it would outlast the legislation. Nobody withdrew the housing provision thinking it would produce this particular consequence in this particular town. The things that produce catastrophes are rarely designed. They accumulate, they compound, they intersect in places no one was watching until the emergency services started making the calls, and then they become the story that someone has to tell. The compound is patient. It was patient for 35 years the first time. It will be patient again. What changes is not the compound. What changes, or doesn't, is the gap it finds when it arrives.